Okay, here we are, week number 4, halfway through the course. So this particular day, in this particular lecture, we're going to talk about sustainable tourism and sustainable development. Just to briefly recap, modernism began about 400 years ago in Western Europe, some white males, and they collectively had the idea that they no longer wanted to be born into a caste system like a lower class, middle class, or upper class in the church, and have no social mobility and have to accept everything based on faith, what their religion or their society tells them to believe. So instead, they came up essentially with the idea to use science and technology and the power of their mind, their rationality, their logic to compete and progress in society by developing new technologies, new ideas, new, more efficient, effective, and methodical ways of doing things. And as a consequence of this modernist idea, um, we have industrial agriculture, the industrialization, right? Factory building production at much higher efficiency, all in the name of the public good. And of course, new technologies arise even faster now than they did before. And all of this driven by the power of the mind. So those who could capture the power of the mind could achieve great things, could achieve great wealth and fame. They didn't need their physical bodies anymore to compete, to become leaders. So this competition, this professional competition, is a very important part of modernism. The best people rise up. But of course, this produced a lot of damages in the process. None of these will be a surprise to you, but exploitation of resources, natural resources, great amounts of pollution of all kinds, globalization and homogenation of culture, right? Where people are put into very simple buckets where before they may have a great deal of cultural diversity. Now they're in much simpler categories, which makes it easier to manage too, right? In modernist terms. So great things came out of modernism, as I think I've mentioned before, like many of the technologies and the nation state and modern medicine, things that we depend on every single day. But those came at a cost, significant cost to the environment, to minority groups that could not compete very well. And of course, the damages that postmodern caused and continues to cause generated a feedback and negative reaction among many people, including some modernists who wanted to use modern tools to mitigate modern damages, as well as postmodern as well. So yes, there's the overcoming. I just want to mention there's a couple more slides and overcoming culture. Postmodernism wanted to fix the problems by having more sustainable and more environment oriented, by promoting multiculturalism, by promoting environmental justice and sustainability. Right? These are the things that we've tried to do as part of a response to the modernist ills and damages. Another very famous one, and as I've mentioned earlier, is Limits to Growth, which came out in 1972, which is a modernist strategy of using computer models and global data to show that the way our economy is currently operating on and continuing to grow economically and consume more and more resources and produce more and more pollution is not sustainable and eventually will lead to civilizational collapse if we continue down the same path that we're on. And this modernist book, very famous, very important, contributed very directly to the Brundtland Report and Our Common Future by the World Commission on Environment and Development, which was one of the very first to define what sustainability is. To really emphasize the importance of intergenerational equity. You may have heard North American Indian tribes, and I'm not sure if this is true, but even if it isn't, the point is important that they always need to consider in every act 7 generations, the effect on 7 generations into the future. So the definition of sustainable development that came out of this monumental conference, chaired by Gro Brundtland, the Prime Minister of Sweden, and followed up with this proceedings book, was that development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So inherent in this definition, we see we can't overconsume. We need to think about intergenerational equity and consumption and meeting needs of the future. And if we do too much damage now, we damage the possibilities of our offspring and our grandchildren of being able to meet their needs, and let alone all the non-human organisms as well that share the planet with us. So it was a bit of a call to arms for sustainable development that limits to growth, was arguing that it is possible to have continuous, sustained, qualitative improvement without having to continually grow our economy and grow our consumption. Part of the assumption there is that there are enough resources in the world that, if distributed more equitably, could allow everyone to have satisfying lives far into the future. So the overall goal then in the limits to growth idea is long-term sustainability of the economy and the environment. So what are some of the strategies that actually were captured and written down in Our Common Future? Just to give you an idea of some of the aspects that people then were thinking about in terms of sustainable development. All right, we've got 2 lists, strategic imperatives as well as principles. I'll just share some of these. Reviving growth, so this came out in the 70s, I guess, is to have growth that contributes to development. Changing the quality of growth, so it's not just growth for its own sake, but growth that contributes to sustainable development. Meeting all essential human needs, so eliminating poverty and things like that, both exterior needs and interior needs. Ensuring a sustainable level of population, right? Our population is an important, our continually growing population continues to put great strain on the resources of the planet, making sustainability more difficult. Reorient technology and managing risk so that the technology is contributing once again to sustainable development. And risk, especially for poor people, is managed. So the bulk of the risk isn't all on necessarily the poorest people. Making sure that environment and economics are always together in all decisions, and they're not just economical decisions. On the principle side, there's the substitutability of capital. So we want to use new kinds of capitals that allow development to continue and not necessarily keep extracting, for example, petroleum. Then maybe we use the sun and as a different source, different kinds of capitals. We've talked about intergenerational equity. Those who pollute should pay more to mitigate or reduce their pollution. Precautionary principle, right? Don't be basically be careful with what we're doing before we launch new initiatives. Make sure we understand what the consequences could be. Integration of environmental, social, economic concerns in all decision-making across all sectors, territories, generations, and elimination fragmentation. So make sure that the politicians aren't just thinking about politics, they're also thinking about environment, and in the economic sector, they're thinking of, basically make sure all the different sectors are thinking about all the other sectors. And of course, this resulted in the sustainable development goals, which we talked about, as well as the inner development goals, which is not a United Nations. This is another private initiative, arguing that we need inner development goals to be able to carry out the exterior sustainable development goals. And without the inner, we can't do the outer. Without the outer, ultimately, we can't do the inner either. We need them both. So what might sustainable development look like globally? It's There's all kinds of great images on the internet. But this image really doesn't show us very much at all. For example, sustainable development requires a stable or a reduced human population. The human economy is not producing more than the earth produces. For example, that's why the global ecological footprint exists, to measure that, both what humanity or civilization economy is consuming per year and how much the earth is actually producing. And producing meaning like producing more natural resources and consuming or eliminating pollution, which is also something that is really important. As we destroy natural resources, the capacity of the earth to reduce pollution or to mitigate pollution that's already been emitted goes down. The idea of cradle to grave, so every object produced, say a cell phone, it can be completely recycled. All the parts go back into other functions in the economy. So essentially producing no more waste, essentially increasing the efficiency of our economic system. Equity and justice, to make sure that there is an equitable distribution of wealth and production and opportunities. The argument being that there's more than enough wealth in the world to meet everyone's basic essential needs, yet, of course, a lot of that wealth is concentrated in the hands of a few, and the hands of the many have little or nothing at all. We also need that people continue to increase their consciousness, their maturity, their own evolution, their own inner development, their own inner goals, their own inner capacities is a necessary part of a sustainable society. Then the big question is it achievable? Is it just utopia? That we don't know. For example, there's many factors we don't usually even consider, like space travel. How will space travel affect sustainability once humans can start mining in other parts of the world and living, other parts of the solar system and living? Another important issue that oftentimes gets left out of the sustainable development conversation, see if I can get this video to work here. It's a 1-minute video, hopefully to give you an idea. Here it comes.
We are coming from the deep, cold reaches of the solar system, flying in toward the sun. Passing the orbits of Neptune and the binary pair Pluto and Charon, we are seeing our home system as it may look about 5 billion years from now. Looking closely, we see that something's gone dramatically wrong with the sun. Its fuel supply running low, our star now swells in size, becoming a red giant, engulfing the orbits of Mercury, Venus, and our Earth. The sun now goes unstable and puffs off shells of plasma and gas, eventually hurling outwards the components of what will become an immense fluorescent nebula for all the galaxy to see. What remains of the sun now shrinks down to become a dense, cold white dwarf star, the lonely cinder of the former planet Mars as its closest companion.
So if the sun is the epitome or the best example we have in our solar system of sustainability, and even it will come to an end, it makes us ask the question then, what time scale do we look at to determine when something is sustainable? In fact, here we go. A famous book written by Jared Diamond called Collapse, in which he studied civilizations throughout human history. He concluded that of all the different civilizations and societies we had, only 5 have never collapsed. So most of them have collapsed. And then it makes you wonder, well, the Chinese is one of those, been around for 5,000 years. I guess we could call them sustainable. The Roman Empire lasted roughly 1,000 years. Can we call the empire sustainable? It collapsed. Then we have the United States, which has been around for 248 years. Is that enough time to be sustainable? Or how about the United Nations, which has only been around for 78 years? Is it headed for collapse, or is it sustainable? Even more interesting. The S&P 500 are some of the 500 biggest companies in the world. And there was a study done and an article published in 2016 that said in 1958, S&P 500 companies had an average lifetime of only 61 years before they disappeared. And now, in 2016, that average lifetime dropped to only 16 years. So the biggest companies in the world are only lasting on average 16 years. By 2027, according to this 2016 article, 75% of all the S&P 500 companies in 2016 will be gone. So how long does anything need to be before we consider it sustainable? I mean, just look at a graph and how very simple we can be confused into thinking about what sustainability is. So something like in tourism industry may grow over time, hit a plateau, which we could call sustainability, only to find that there's a collapse on the other side. Now, if this plateau is only a few weeks, that's definitely not sustainability by anyone's measure. A few months, definitely not. A few years, is that sustainable? A few decades? Because you can see there is no right answer to how long something needs to be sustained to be sustainable. Depends on the time frame that you're looking at. And by looking at the wrong time frame, or at least certain time frames, we can be fooled into thinking something is sustainable when it isn't. But unfortunately, oftentimes you need to wait till after something has collapsed to know how long it actually was sustainable. So now we want to be able to apply this to tourism. See, there's a huge timeline in history, and look for the pieces that are sustainable in this timeline. Can be challenging. So ultimately, how long sustainable tourism needs to maintain its conditions to be sustainable is a question that we're going to look at now as we enter the talk about sustainable tourism. Now, we already know from a previous discussion that our goal in general terms is to maximize the positive impacts of tourism while minimizing the negative ones, as we live in a dice world. And of course, there are various modalities or concepts of tourism that have emerged to try and specifically take that perspective. You've heard of ecotourism, responsible tourism, sustainable tourism, and now there's regenerative tourism. All kinds of new terms always emerging. But the important thing to remember is that tourism needs certain conditions to survive, just like animals do, right? Animals need water, shelter, air, food. I don't actually have the list for tourism, but we can imagine there needs to be demand, there needs to be enough resources, there needs to be enough trained personnel, right? The policy environment needs to be right for it to exist over time. People need to believe in it. So we could come up with a list of the basic needs, and I'm sure somebody has. Maybe I'll look for the document that talks about that at some point. And as I mentioned, the same thing with humans. And of course, just like humans, we generate positive and negative impacts, and tourism does as well. So simply maintaining tourism over time, generating positive and negative impacts, isn't necessarily sustainable because it doesn't necessarily imply improvement. And sometimes we get that mix, that sustainable tourism is tourism we want to keep over time, but we have to remember it also needs to have net positive improvements. Now, the definition of sustainable tourism, according to the World Tourism Organization, is a tourism that takes full account of its current and future economic, social, environmental impacts, addressing the needs of visitors, the industry, environment, and host communities. So this, again, is basically arguing for no net damage in the present and in the future. Oh, I think this was my graphic to show some basic needs of tourism. Here we go. There's the definition. Tourism that takes full account of its current and future economic, social, environmental, addressing needs. But for me, that doesn't really imply improvement. So it still needs something more. In fact, there is more definition, more aspects of this, because this comes from the 2005 book, Making Tourism More Sustainable, a guide for policy managers, which is a document that the World Tourism Organization still cites, and it is in the reading. At least it's an optional reading, so you can check it out. Well, what are some of the other elements that sustainable tourism should have according to this document? Oops, I think I skipped over one. All right, here we go. Makes optimal use of environmental resources that constitute a key element in tourism development, maintaining essential ecological processes and helping to conserve natural and biodiversity. So that's no net damage. Respect the socio-cultural authenticity of host communities, conserve their built and living cultural heritage, and contribute to intercultural understanding. So there could be something positive there because it's talking about contributing to intercultural understanding, but it's also basically maintaining, respecting the current authenticity, not talking about improving anything. Ensure viable long-term economic operations, providing socioeconomic benefits to all stakeholders that are fairly distributed, including stable employment and income earning opportunities, social services to host communities, and contributing to poverty alleviation. All right, now in this third point, we're talking about improvements, right? We're not talking about just keeping things the way they are. We're talking about improving things. And this is where kind of there's this idea of regenerative tourism moving beyond sustainable. So if sustainable tourism is just to do no net damage, then regenerative tourism is to bring positive benefits above and beyond what was there before. So here are some benefits that actually the same document from 2005 points out is educational, transformational for tourists and residents, positive experiences, conserve place and heritage, tangible and intangible aspects. Heritage communities could increase their self-esteem, their self-worth, sense of place, pride. They have greater local control. There's environmental benefits. Respects the local culture and tradition. Quality over quantity. Actually, I think this is a list I put together. This is not from 2005. Help managers meet their management objectives in protected areas. In some, yeah, this is me. Net positive impacts across multiple capitals and stakeholders, not just no net damage for as long as possible. So that's potentially a definition of sustainable tourism, or maybe my definition of regenerative tourism, even though I don't share any of the regenerative tourism literature in our in our course. But basically net positive impacts across multiple capitals and stakeholders for as long as possible. Since we really don't know how long we can sustain something, we know it won't be forever. So as long as possible. So in short, sustainability should leave the environment, the community, and economy, and all their respective capitals in better shape, in higher quality than when tourism founded or than when tourism started at a destination. It also, of course, has to sustain its resources and conditions that it needs to survive for as long as possible. And the limits to growth has a definition of, or one of its main conclusions about sustainability, which I think is relevant here. It says, it is possible to alter these growth trends that we're seeing in society right now and to establish a condition of ecological and economic stability that is sustainable far into the future, i.e., as long as possible. The future of global equilibrium could be designed so that the basic material needs of each person on Earth are satisfied and each person has an equal opportunity to realize his individual human potential. So that was one of the major conclusions of Limits to Growth. This their attempt to have a good positive hope for the future, despite the fact that most of their scenarios ended in economic collapse. Here's a metaphor that may or may not be useful, but if we think of tourism as a machine, right, that is constantly generating benefits, such as these needs, and it is consuming resources, how long can we keep this machine running and have it still producing benefits, net positive benefits? Because it's always going to be having damage as well. How long can this machine continue to operate in any given destination? Now, one way to keep this machine operating is to improve its resilience. Now, you may have heard of this concept. Resilience is a characteristic of a system that allows us, or for example, tourism, to continue carrying out the mission or its objectives in the face of adversity and disruptions. You know, in this dice world, there's always disruptions, there's always new challenges. Well, does tourism at a particular destination or tourism globally have the mettle, have what it takes to keep operating successfully, generating net positive benefits despite these disruptions, and to maintain its fundamental function, which is, you know, sending people all over the world and having positive experiences and hopefully improving those places. So resilience is about guarding against change that happens too quickly. It's a resilient system wants to retain its integrity despite the attacks, despite the disturbances. It's not about avoiding change and impact, because we know that can't happen. So aside from the sun, again, let's look at some systems that may have been or not have been resilient. Again, and to that, we need to know about also the time scale. Like the city of Troy in Greek mythology held off the Greek army of Agamemnon for over 9 years before finally the Trojan horse led to their downfall. So in many ways, Troy had a lot of resilience. It had big walls, good organization, had good internal fortitude, but it had a weak spot, you know, and they were tricked by the Greeks, who took advantage of that weak spot. I'm not exactly sure how to call it, but clearly it was a failure point, because a wooden horse filled with soldiers who then opened the gates at night from the inside, exposed a vulnerability, probably an overconfidence in the king of Troy, whose name I just can't barely remember, who allowed the Trojan horse to enter Troy and become its downfall. The World Health System, you know, it was took on the COVID pandemic and survived, although some argue certain national health systems, such as Yemen's, actually collapsed. So, but I think we can say the World Health System had enough resilience to absorb the impact of the COVID pandemic and continue operating. It continued to maintain its functionality. Communication remained high between its many different parts, and we'll look at qualities of resilience in just a second. The hurricane in New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina did great damage, but the city's still there. It's now operating again. They've actually increased their resilience, I believe, because they're trying to protect more of their mangroves and the forest that would protect against it. They've built different new dike system, and they've done a number of architectural and structural changes to increase the ability of New Orleans to continue functioning in the face of inevitable hurricanes. So in that case, the disturbance increased resilience after suffering some consequences. It also happens on an interior, not just exterior. Before the printing press, Gutenberg, the rich, powerful, elite clerics, religious people pretty much had a monopoly on most knowledge, or at least formal knowledge. They alone could read and they alone could write. So they had the books. But once the printing press came out, it allowed, over time, increasingly lower classes to be able to access printed information, fomented reading, fomented writing, and took away, to some degree, that monopoly of the elite class. So for a while, the elite had a resilience, hundreds of years, but over time, that too fell apart. And now we talk about our own civilization, right? You know, how are we able to defend against, how long can we defend against climate change before it collapses? And of course, Jared Diamond's book Collapse and the work by and Limits to Growth indicate that it is a real threat and current threat. So here are some of the qualities of resilient systems in general. We could look at any particular one to see how well. I'm not going to quiz you on them, but we use the word resilience a lot, oftentimes synonymous with resistance and things, but there are some very specific qualities that a resilient system has. Early detection of disturbance. I mean, we might say that the World Health System was able to detect fairly quickly the outbreak of COVID, first in China, and then track it across the planet. Resistance to disturbance, right? There is some resistance to a pandemic, at least in some places more than others, when they stockpile resources and train folks in how to deal with them. Certainly when they, and this is an area that's supposed to be improved, but having more money for teams to go in and find potential pathogens that could become pandemics. Efficient communication. I mean, I haven't actually studied it in detail, but it would seem to me there was very efficient communication throughout the pandemic. Here in Costa Rica, the Minister of Health would have a daily report, would be in constant, continuous contact with the World Health Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, the CDC in the United States. They were in high levels of communication. Efficient protection of critical capacities from disruption. Certainly, we saw in the case of Troy, there was some capacity overconfidence that was not protected. But in other systems, in New Orleans, well, they began to protect them much better after the hurricane. Rapid response, how fast can the system respond, or does it ignore it? Like right now, climate change, a good part of our system is still ignoring it despite the evidence. Redundancy of function. So if you have two stockpiles of vaccines, for example, and one gets wiped out, then the system can still operate because there's vaccines in another place, because there is redundancy. Redundancy is expensive. And in modernist lean technology, redundancy is oftentimes eliminated because it saves money to get rid of redundancy. But that same redundancy allows a system to be more resilient. A lack of singular failure points. For example, the wall around Troy, right? It was equally strong on all sides. There was no one failure point that the Greeks could attack, except for perhaps the overconfidence of King Priam. I think that's the name. Priam, that's the name of the king from Troy. Okay, now I go to sleep tonight with comfort. A recovery speed, how fast does it recover? Right? Can the system have the resources to fix, to build up new area? In like New Orleans, the United States government spent a lot of money through the FEMA agency to rebuild New Orleans and hopefully build it better. And innovation, can the system innovate its way out of problems by creating? And a good example perhaps of innovation, going back to Cancun, which I think we talked about last week, one of the innovations of Mexico, if not Cancun, was to stay open during the pandemic while everybody else shut down. That gave them a comparative advantage in the marketplace. And in fact, we could argue that Cancun is an example of sustainable tourism in the sense that the hotel sector has been able to sustain itself over time, despite predictions and despite threats of over densification and lowering prices and reducing the visitor experience, quality of visitor experience. It survived all of those. And it's continuing to operate, partly because of new destinations around it that are rising. So it is proving to be sustainable, but I think few people would argue that that really is sustainable tourism, and because it's not necessarily producing net positive benefits. I just wanted to give you another interesting example from Costa Rica. Again, this is just a 1-minute video of one destination here by National Geographic, and we'll briefly talk about it. Whoops, my bad. So Fortuna, Costa Rica had an active volcano for, I don't know, 30 years or something. And it was I remember one time when I was living in Costa Rica in the middle 90s, one day with a friend, had sleeping bags, and we found a place in a cow pasture, the base of the volcano. We lied back at night in our sleeping bags, looked up and could see the lava, the red glow at the top of the mountain. It was amazing. And that amazingness was shared by many tourists and attracted many people to the area. And then, as the video briefly mentioned, the volcano went quiet, it went dormant. And that sent the community into crisis because their principal attraction has now been silenced. No more lava coming out, no more rumbling, no more smoke, no more any of the pyrotechnics that attracted so many tourists. Now, you'd think with such a disturbance, that system probably would be overwhelmed, but they found resilience within them. They came together and organized as a community. They managed to invest in new tourism offerings. And as a result of that threat to their self-identity, to their existence, the community came out stronger than before, and now is the adventure tourism capital of Costa Rica. You can do many things there. You saw multiple pictures in the video, still always looking at the volcano, but not with any glowing. So the volcano is now the centerpiece, but not the lava anymore. Oftentimes we think that when we're confronted with a problem, we just find a way to fix it, which is very reductionist, because oftentimes the ability to fix it depends on the resilience factors that are already there waiting for that crisis to come up. And in the case of Fortuna, and again, I haven't studied it, but just looking at the particular case, they apparently had a lot of social capital, which is connections between people and social cohesion, that they worked very well together. And they were able to come up with a new common consensus vision. And they were able to find the resources to invest in new offerings and market it in a new way. So a lot of these are qualities that existed, perhaps latent, waiting for the crisis. And the crisis came in a big way by turning off their volcano. But they survived and they continued. So what are other ways that we can use to try and increase the resilience and the effectiveness of tourism? I can get to the next slide. Hold on 1 second. Okay, here we go. So one way is to follow best practices and criteria. Now, these here come from the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, and these are their criteria of best practices. This particular set, there's several different sets, are for destination management organizations. So there's section A, B, C, D, excuse me, on different things that a destination manager should be doing. It doesn't really go into much detail. It's just to show you the overriding categories. And there's a really important reference for anyone who's going to work around tourism. If you're the protected area manager, the destination, whether you're a tour operator, there are sets of criteria for each of these different subsectors of the tourism industry. As you can see here, sustainable management, this is from the destination's perspective. Obviously goes into much more detail about management and structure and framework, how to engage stakeholders, how to manage pressure and change, how to protect cultural heritage, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea isn't to study these in detail in this particular moment, is to make you aware that there are globally recognized standards that you can use and apply to make your sustainable tourism both net positive in terms of its impacts and also more resilient. There's also principles of tourism and management in Lung, which is kind of the de facto textbook from IUCN on sustainable tourism. They have principles of tourism and visitor management. I'm not going to go over them here. You can find various other principles. in different other sources. But again, that's another way to try to hone your organization. Another is local control, right? Having local control, because local control increases resilience in a number of different ways by increasing communication, increasing trust. People obviously are very highly motivated, dedicated. They know their resources better. And it's oftentimes argued for local control in many of the principles and guidelines about sustainable tourism. I would mention that Anna Spenceley, one of the lead authors and leaders in sustainable tourism in the world, says it is local control has some big challenges, though. It's very tough for local communities to access national and international markets if all they do is live in a local place, as well as capital investment. Usually local communities don't have much capital, and they need to work with tour operators and government agencies and nonprofits from the capital city and international as well. Another big challenge is that local communities oftentimes are unable to understand the perspective of national, international tourists and needs. Their worldviews, their perspectives, their needs are very foreign to the realities in local communities. And vice versa, of course, but that's actually part of the attraction for international tourists to come and see how local audiences live or local communities live and work, especially in cultural tourism. But it can also be a huge barrier for local communities to be able to accommodate and meet the needs of international tourists. This is why a destination management organization can be very important, one that can connect different elements of the industry, can take advantage of the resources of national offerings, national governments, international tour operators, and also be composed of locals by bringing together these different perspectives. So that is an area, as I mentioned, one that's focused on in the Global Sustainable Tourism Council standards, and there are organizations. There's a large company in Washington, D.C. Called Solimar International that works to help destinations create destination management organizations in the hope of setting up sustainable and ecotourism. Another idea, remember we talked about Dearden and Doofus in their wildlife tourism model. They argue that, actually they said, for a site to extract the greatest benefit from tourism, it needs to cater for an increase in mainstream tourists, but also have services which are directed at maintaining the specialist segments, which they suggest are high yielding and create more positive marketing exposure. So they argue, need both the mainstream mass tourists as well as specialized tourists. So here you can see the combination of the mass tourists and the specialized bird watchers, for example, spend a lot more money and a lot more time and are a lot lower environmental impact than now. Doofus and Dearden didn't say mass tourism. They said the more generalist tourists. So perhaps the picture up above is not fair to what they were referring to. But the point is the larger numbers of more generic tourists or generalists who don't have the specialized interest. So this kind of brings us down to one of the big questions about sustainable tourism is that if the world is clearly not sustainable at the global level right now, and I think everyone would argue that that's the case, is it really possible to have sustainable tourism in an unsustainable world? I mean, one recent study shows that climate change is undermining the Sustainable Development Goals. The people who are arguing for inner development goals are saying that the Sustainable Development Goals are also being undermined by not having enough interior development. There was one TED video by a researcher from Europe, and I can't find that video anymore, which makes me suspicious what happened to it. But I do remember quite clearly his thesis. He was a systems dynamics. He ran computer models. And the Sustainable Development Goal 8 is about decent work and economic growth. And he argued we would need so much growth to pay for the other sustainable development goals that growth itself would cause collapse, basically, as limits to growth So there isn't enough growth that we can do to meet all of the other sustainable goals. That was his argument. I couldn't track it down anymore, so don't quote me on that, or don't even quote him, whatever his name was. In conclusion, sustainable tourism is a moving target. And obviously, we don't need to know how long tourism has to last to do our best to make it as resilient as possible, make it as net positive as possible. Whether you want to call it sustainable or regenerative or ecotourism, I think that's up to you. But we know underneath those terms what we're trying to do: the economy, the environment, and community, or as others say, people, planet, place, purpose, profits, right? We want to be net positive in all those areas across all their particular capitals, at least for the medium term, for as long as we can, knowing that perturbations and disturbances are on their way, and building consciously some of this resilient features into the system, and not just trying to maximize profits, because that will definitely not benefit resilience and not be net positive in the short, medium, or long term. And let's not forget, this is one of the largest industries in the world. So with that, we'll see you next week, week 5, as we move into the second half of the course.